Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our MSAR webinar on Women Who've Changed the Discussion. This is number 6 in the series. So MSAI is comprised of Ed Collin, Phil Carney, Alan Dunton, and myself, Ollie Logan, and we're passionate about all things skill acquisition, coaching science, and youth development. And we hope that by hosting these webinars, we're able to connect you with some of the leading figures in these respective areas. So again, in what seems like quite a long time ago, we ran our first webinar series in April to June of this year. And if you want to check those out, you can see those on our YouTube page, MSA Ireland. One of our speakers in that series was a lady called Sarah Kelleher, who's a former Ireland field hockey captain and is the current England under-18s coach. And Sarah spoke passionately about the need for greater efforts to raise the profile of female coaches in an interview she did for the Irish Examiner. She said, we need more stories, more voices. So as a response to that call, we've decided to go with this theme of women who've changed the discussion for this series. For this series, we're actually really fortunate to be supported by the 20 by 20 campaign here in Ireland. And 20 by 20 is a campaign to create a cultural shift in the perception of girls and women in sport. So they have 3 main targets: 20% more media coverage of women in sport, 20% more female participation at player, coach, referee, and administrative level, and 20% more attendance at women's games and events. So if you want to check that out, please do so at 20by20.ie. For those of you joining us on Zoom today, please, if you keep yourselves on mute, and if you do have any questions, put those in the chat box during our guest presentation today, and we'll hopefully be able to come to you at the end of the presentation. If you're watching on YouTube Live, then please put your comments, questions in the comments box, and again, we'll monitor those and hopefully be able to bring those questions to our guest today. So that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Ed to introduce today's guest.
Thanks, Phil, and welcome back to those of you who've been with us before, and welcome to any newcomers to our webinar series and to Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland in the first place. So, Anna, it's great to welcome you on board, and thank you so much for your time today. As I mentioned before we started recording, I've been doing a little bit of study on your work in the last couple of weeks, and it's really impressive. It's really impactful work, so which is always great. For those of you who don't know, Anna is a senior lecturer, researcher, and practitioner in sport coaching at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. Her research interests lie in the coach learning and education space, and she has worked on a number of evaluation projects with the FA, UK Sport and UK Coaching, and is also in a very privileged position, having been an elite athlete in the sport of rugby with Saracens in Scotland. She's also now moved into that elite coaching space where she has worked, and I think that's where herself and Ollie met. It was initially with GB Archery, and also then in the football and the rugby space. So without further ado, and I'm really looking forward to getting down and getting into the nuts and bolts of your work, having seen it only on paper. So thank you very much, and the very best of luck.
Thank you, Edward, and thanks to the whole group for inviting me. It's a privilege to be speaking to you today, and I think it's a great initiative that you're kind of forefronting women and like women speakers and women researchers and women sports people, coaches, etc. I was saying before this call, like this year has been a really big year for lots of webinars and podcasts and online opportunities, and it's great that you're using that platform to push some slightly different people, or let's hear some different voices that might not necessarily be put on this platform. So thanks very much. So I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some stuff that I have done in my research, and it's all about how coaches learn. And I think we've probably got a mix of different coaches, maybe some coach developers listening in today. So I'll try and tailor that around that kind of assumption. So I'm going to present some cutting edge coach learning research, illustrate the key ideas using some data and evidence about coaches learning knowledge and practice, consider some implications for coaches and maybe coach developers if we have time, and we'll have a little chance to critically reflect on our own coaching biographies and how that might be influencing our own learning and practice. And as mentioned, it would be good to get people's questions, to have a bit of discussion and gain some feedback and hopefully learn something. So this research about coaches learning comes from this point of view of lifelong learning. So that's rather than the kind of slightly old school idea that we're just empty vessels where you kind of can be filled up with knowledge unproblematically. This is more about thinking of learning as something that happens day to day through all the different experiences that we have. So through this process of living and learning that we gain wisdom. And all of these experiences are embedded within our own biography. So biography is like the sum of different experiences that you have, and you collect that as you go through your life. And this comes from a researcher called Peter Jarvis, who comes from a broader education kind of background. And these things are influencing how we learn and what we learn and why. So I've got this little video here, which kind of, it's an example of that. So obviously it's a picture of Einstein's face, and it's a mask. But when it rotates, you can't see, it's impossible to see the mask as concave, because we've got so much previous experience, so much knowledge about faces being popping out at us. They're convex, so you can't actually see the face as concave. So it just shows you that we have a top-down way of looking at these things. So all of our previous knowledge, it's really strong, and that influences how we perceive things. So just to make it even more seasick, I'll move on to the next bit of the Prezi, if you've had enough mind-bending fun there. So these experiences, they shape our biography. And that's, as I said, some of our experiences, our beliefs, values, knowledge, and practices. And so here are some pictures here that kind of shape my biography, or they're like 3 key things that I think are important in my biography. So on the left here is a picture of the loch, which is next to my house that I grew up in Scotland, or my parents' house, in kind of a rural background and area. And both my parents were teachers. And I remember growing up seeing how much hard work they put into that and thinking I never would want to be a teacher because it looks really, really hard. But somehow I've ended up being researching learning and working in coach education and being a lecturer. So clearly that sort of background has influenced my sort of interest in this kind of stuff and an interest in learning about learning and sort of developing myself and other people. Then top right is a picture of me playing rugby for Scotland, and that was something that I took up pretty late, and I never thought that I'd actually get that opportunity to play rugby or to represent my country, anything. So that was a bit of a surprise, and I guess that influences my kind of coaching approach and wanting to give people opportunities and like discover the potential they might not have known that they had otherwise. And then at the bottom, that's me in the coaching team with Cambridge University women's rugby team. And I guess that's sort of something that I'm involved in now. That's them after winning the varsity match last year against the other place whose name we don't mention. And that's become part of my biography as well. So it'd be really great if people can start to think about, maybe you have a couple of 2 or 3 key things that you could pick out as important to you, your biography, something that has influenced your experiences in sport, or it could be broader, and maybe just stick them in the chat box. If you're feeling particularly thoughtful and reflective on a Friday afternoon, you might want to maybe start to draw some links with how does that influence what you learn? How does that influence what you choose to engage with? How does that influence like how you go about your professional development as a coach or a coach developer? So I'll kind of move on and sort of keep an eye on the chat as we go. But yeah, it'd be really great to see some people maybe share some things about their biography, and perhaps a couple of really quick reflections on how that might have influenced their approach. So into the coach learning research. So the research I'm going to talk to you about is, it was done in a football setting, so soccer, if you prefer that. I suppose one thing that I didn't put in my little pictures there is I've actually stopped playing rugby in the past year, and I've been playing a bit of Gaelic football actually. So I was going to add a picture of that, but I couldn't get it to add to my Prezi at the late time that I left to find it, but yeah, this is about soccer, not Gaelic football. So coaches, the research has shown that coaches learn from a blend of different interconnected experiences. And so if you coach, you can probably recognize that. You might have learned from experience coaching, your experiences playing might have informed the things that you want to put into practice, coach education, formal, mentoring, so loads of different things, they all kind of come together. But if we look at this picture here of a kind of typical soccer coach education setting, each of those men that are in that picture will they'll come to that with a different biography, a different set of experiences. And so this apparently similar kind of learning situation that they're all taking part in, they'll end up taking different things from that. So it will result in uneven learning across individuals. So that kind of shows us that learning seems to occur through more of an active interaction between learners and other people in specific social contexts, rather than just them being filled up like an empty vessel unproblematically. So I was interested in finding out how that process happens. And this research looked at 25 soccer coaches. They were working in Premier League academies, centres of excellence, girls, player development centres, grassroots clubs. And they were all sort of level 2, level 3, so above level 2, between level 2 and 3. And most of them were taking part in a formal coach education course, but there was also a kind of comparison group who were matched in terms of their coaching experience and qualifications that weren't currently taking part in a formal coach education course. And so I followed them over the course of a year and a half, and looked at their practice. So some people I just interviewed them and then followed up, but then for a kind of smaller amount of people, I went really in depth and looked at videoing their coaching practice before they went on a course, interviewing them using video clips to find out what knowledge they thought they were using and where they thought they got that knowledge from. Then observed them on the course, observed the coach educators, and followed up with those coaches 6 months later to find out the same. So kind of compare their coaching practice, videoed them again, interviewed them again, 3 times each side of the intervention, if you want to call it that, and tracked almost how their knowledge changed, how their behaviours changed, and compared that with the people that weren't taking part in a coach education course. And so from that, I did a thing called grounded theory, where it's grounded in the data. So you make a theory, you make a model, but it's grounded, it's built from the data. So you follow a methodological process to make something that's not just like an idealistic representation, it's actually based on the data. So I found this kind of filter process where individuals were kind of adapting, rejecting different elements of these learning experiences that they encountered. And so they seem to be filtering out different ideas through this double loop filter. So first of all, they had an individual kind of filter, and then it was kind of applying it to different contexts. And they were going through these cycles of reflective conversations where they were trying out stuff, experimenting, adapting, or rejecting again. So as mentioned there, individual coaches, they learned different things from the same educational experience, but yeah, they were actively filtering it out, and this kind of grounded theory helps us explain how that process happened. So that's kind of a simplified version of it. I think we'll go for the really complex one. So don't be scared of this diagram. This is the grounded theory diagram, but I've kind of put lots of data in there to help explain or illustrate using some quotes. So I'll kind of whiz through this, do my best to explain a little bit. So it starts with the elements of learning experience, so the concepts. So those are kind of ideas or different nuggets of information that you might come across in any learning experience. So coaches talked about different bits and pieces that they were picking up, and these had a shared meaning. So they're kind of abstract shared things, and then through the learning process, coaches kind of made their own individual sense of that. So sometimes coaches would have these ideas or bits and pieces. There are things that they already knew about, they already kind of bought into. They matched the coach's biography, matched their previous experiences. And so when it matched, you can kind of see in that sort of blue box there, when you go down the arrow, it meant that they were just kind of reinforcing their existing biography. They were doing more of that same stuff. So in the little kind of dark speech bubble there, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, depends on how big your screen is, but it's just a coach explaining a quote saying, when you work with an individual player rather than stopping everyone. That was an example of a concept, an idea they came across in the course that they already did. So it matched their biography. And they were just going to make sure they did much more of that. It's just reinforcing what they already did. So alternatively, there was also situations where the coaches would come across concepts or ideas that really kind of mismatched it with their biography. So it might be something they completely disagreed with. And you can sort of see in the little quote up the top there, that's an example of a coach saying something that they didn't agree with. And that was a stumbling block rather than actually thinking, I'll give it a go, even though I don't think it's going to work. So you tend to stick to what you know. And this was kind of a way where coaches could just cherry pick different ideas that fitted in with what they already believed, what they already did. So not really much of a learning process going on there. Then if it didn't sort of completely kind of mismatch or match what the coaches already knew, their biography, then a third kind of option was that it might kind of fit in with their biography. So something that they could maybe see is relevant to them, but they didn't know about it before. And so then they moved from that individual level filter into the context level filter. So at that point, it wasn't quite as simple as just taking what fits and putting it into practice. They had to get through the context filter next. So I kind of skipped through that a little bit there, but we can come back to discuss the individual filter later. But this second level filter also happened, and that actually overruled biography. So that's quite important. So it might be an idea, if you look at the speech bubble at the bottom there, might be an idea that the coach really thinks is good and it kind of fits in with their biography. But if they thought that it wasn't going to work in their context, then they would just reject it at that point. So this coach saying like it's okay, but we've got a syllabus that we work to. It's difficult to use this whole part whole method of coaching because we've got our syllabus and that works, and why would we change it? We're told what to do. So yeah, that's me. And that was when the concept, these ideas, they started to become a bit more kind of applied to particular context and organized around the coaches' beliefs of how they were going to implement that. And the judgment these coaches were making might be influenced by things like the curriculum, the syllabus, but also by other coaches that they're working with and players that they're working with. So I had an example of one coach that went on the course and he was absolutely loving all the different ideas. It really chimed with what he thought, and he was so enthusiastic and wanted to try them all out. And so he did sort of try to do that, but it didn't really match the context. I remember filming the session, and there was a load of parents standing behind me watching that session, and he was kind of getting the players to sort of explore, try out different ways of doing things, and it was absolute chaos, obviously, as you'd kind of expect, because you'd sort of given them free rein. And you could hear the parents kind of grumbling behind you, going, "What is this guy doing? Like, he's not. Yeah, he has no clue what he's doing. He's not really a coach." And then, sure enough, like a couple of weeks later, the club have got kind of old guard traditional coach in there working with him, just to sort of keep an eye on him and keep him on the straight and narrow. So the context didn't necessarily work for the things that coach wanted to learn. Didn't necessarily fit. So the context was so important. So then if it was something that they thought might work in the context, the coach would go through that process of trying it out. So put the try out in the kind of bottom left there. And then that would trigger that reflective conversation. So a reflective conversation is more than just a chat between a couple of people. It's actually a theoretical term that represents that process where you experiment with something, you come up with a strategy, experiment with it. You might then, if it works, you might keep doing it, but if it doesn't work, you might sort of follow that arrow up through the middle and back up to the top where it says reject or adapt. So you might reject it, you might get rid of it if it doesn't work, but you might then adapt it, and then try again through a bit of reflection, kind of making judgments over whether it works or not. And so that was quite interesting in my research, because the coaches were doing that, but they didn't necessarily kind of acknowledge how they knew that something worked, or it wasn't very explicit sort of judgment at all. It's more just a, that works, I'll try it. And here a coach here is talking about it's quite upsetting when you really don't know what works. And we'll come back to that point in a few minutes. So this is experiential learning, bridging that gap between the kind of shared idea that they've come across, creating an individual understanding of it, and then understanding how to put it into practice. So then you can see that that idea becomes very individualized to that coach. I think that quote there in the top right is just about just kind of showing you how tacit that process was for the coaches. So they weren't really thinking too much about it. So, you know, whatever you think would be the best way to set it up, then if it doesn't work, just evaluate, and next time that didn't work, so we'll try it a different way this time. If it did work, just do it the same. So not necessarily a lot of thought and detail going into that. So if it did work, that would be put into their kind of biography, which is the big green circle, which would then change, and then that acts as a lens or a filter for the next kind of set of experiences that the coach might come across. So it was kind of a process that influences biography, which in turn influences how you see the rest of your kind of learning experiences. I'm quite interested in this bit at the top between the reject or adapt. So there was different things that impacted on how coaches made that decision. And as I said, it was quite a tacit decision. So coaches that were working in a very kind of open context, maybe if they were used to kind of sharing and swapping ideas with different coaches within their context, they were much more likely to maybe try stuff out and adapt and get it wrong, make mistakes, and go again. And the quote at the top is talking a little bit about conceptions of knowledge. So like if you believe that there's a right and a wrong, then it is not necessarily so conducive to trying out different things and making mistakes, etc. Whereas if you believe that there are different ways of doing things and you need to come to your own reasoned perspective, then that tended to be a little bit more a kind of better approach, like better personal openness to adapting stuff. Okay, so that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope that the busyness of this slide didn't confuse anyone too much, but don't worry, I've got a summary and a more simplified version in case anyone's completely lost. So yeah, the research found that coaches in that research, they actively constructed and adapted their knowledge for use in socially situated coaching practice. So the context was really important, and the people that they were working with too. There seemed to be a double loop individual level filter where they were filtering out different ideas, and also a contextual level filter, and then a reflective conversation. But the design of coach learning opportunities can fail to accommodate some of these processes. So again, if you think of your biography, if you're a coach or a coach developer, you might have been on different coaching qualifications, or etc., where they might not have sort of realized or allowed you to navigate that process very well. So what are the implications for you as a coach or you as a coach developer? We might potentially get to chat about that. And this is a simplified version, so I promised that. So I presented this research with UK coaching coach developers back in May, kind of back in the early days of the lockdown heyday for webinars, etc. And a guy called Kurt Lindley was watching. He's a sort of educational consultant, and he got in touch to make a blog post about this paper, which is referenced at the bottom there. And all he did was take the headings from each bit of the academic paper and kind of make a sort of recommendation of what like advice for a coach that wants to learn more effectively from each of those different headings or subheadings. And then I made a drawing of the individual level filter, because as we saw, the grounded theory, that was made for an academic paper. So it was made for an academic audience and to be published. Whereas, you know, it's quite complex and maybe not the best way to get that across for a practitioner or somebody that's coming at it from not necessarily knowing the academic jargon, etc. So I reimagined the individual level filter as a coffee filter. And so on the right at the top there, we've got the reject bit. So the coffee filter is your biography, and the reject bit might be something that you completely disagree with, something that contradicts your beliefs, your previous experiences. And so that doesn't get through the filter, it doesn't get into your cup. Whereas the green bit, that might be something that you know already, it matches your biography, so it goes straight through, it doesn't even touch the filter, it goes straight into your cup. Whereas in the middle, in the kind of yellow, we've got stuff that fits in. So it's neither reject or match, somewhere in the middle, and it's got kind of permeable kind of filter bits. So it might filter through into your coffee cup. But obviously, once you've got your coffee, you've still got to try it in your context and see what it tastes like, see if it works in your context. So if it's kind of later on in the afternoon, if it was me, I don't really need any caffeine at the moment. I'm kind of buzzing enough with this opportunity. So yeah, that wouldn't be right for my context. So I might just not bother with that. I might have to put a bit of decaf in the top of the filter instead. So yeah, this is kind of an example of the like a hopefully easier to understand example of the individual level filter. Then we've got the little hammer at the top, and that's the hammer of disjuncture. So you might remember the quote that I kind of picked out in the main model, which was talking about how it's so uncomfortable when you don't even know what works anymore. And that's kind of an example of disjuncture. So that's when your biography really is challenged and it really doesn't match this new idea that's really challenging you. So it's that kind of uncomfortable feeling that you get when you're challenged, basically. And it's actually a moment of opportunity for learning. So an example from the course was when a coach developer or tutor was talking about in soccer or football, a practice that uses 4 goals. So he was kind of saying, you know, if you use 4 goals, then it's not representative, it's not realistic to the game, because you only have 2 goals in soccer. So you shouldn't be using that. Any kind of practice with 4 goals, that's not realistic. Don't bother with that. And you could almost see everyone in the classroom kind of reeling from that, because they were kind of like, oh, I love that 4-goal game. I think it works really well for getting the players to move it wide, and that's something that they were kind of tied to in their biography, and accepted practice that they kind of liked, and it was part of their biography. But that was actually a moment of potential for the coach developer to kind of question, you know, why do you like that practice so much? What is it about it that's useful? In what sort of circumstances? And really explore their underpinning knowledge and help them to maybe learn about that concept of realism to the game in practice, etc. And maybe rebuild some of that carnage that you just left with that hand grenade. But unfortunately, it was an opportunity missed in that situation. It was quite a short course, so maybe didn't have time to explore that kind of thing. But the hammer of disjuncture is a kind of a representation of that ability to sort of break down part of the filter. And so the moment of opportunity for learning. So it depends on somebody else potentially to rebuild that and connect to a new understanding. So I've actually whizzed through that. He said 40 minutes, but I've got through in 30, so bang on time, and that's good because it leaves more time for discussion, hopefully. So presented an example of some coach learning research that looks at the process of learning. Used a bit of data and evidence to explain what I meant by that with a grounded theory, which is based on the data. I didn't really consider the implications for coach developers and coaches, but perhaps those listening in will. And hopefully you've had a chance to reflect on your own coaching biography and how that might be influencing your own learning and practice. Maybe a tip is to think about previous experiences on coach education courses, for example, and think of, have you ever come across like one of those grenade moments where someone says something that really challenges what you think and you really disagree, or kind of the opposite, where you come across something that you really buy into and you think, oh, this is great, I'm just getting reinforced, like my practice is getting reinforced. So we'd be really keen to open up a discussion, answer some questions, gain some feedback on those areas, and learn from all of the esteemed listeners here.
Great, thank you very much for that, Anna. That's a really great oversight of the work that you've done. So I think we'll head over to Ed. Ed, do you want to start up with a few questions? Anna, if you wanted to stop sharing your screen there, that would that'd be good. Thank you.
Yeah, and loads of questions actually, and I know there's already questions coming through as well from the group listening in. So thank you very much for that. So I just to kick things off, one thing that jumped out at me around the reflective practice that you spoke about, that is involved in that, the process essentially. Do you find that that's a difficult skill for coaches to acquire if they aren't already reflective, and or if they do want to acquire it, what are the processes that you tend to see them going through to acquire that skill of being a reflective coach?
Okay, that's a big question. Thank you. I think in my research, I wasn't necessarily looking at their reflective practice particularly, but I just found that they automatically kind of did it without really thinking about it too much. And I suppose I found the same in my own teaching as a university lecturer and trying to get sort of that reflective practice across. So got examples of, so we at Anglia Ruskin University, we've got an online soccer coaching degree. And I've tried to apply this research to the design of one of the modules on that degree, and following up with the students to try and do some research on that process too. Got examples of soccer coaches who say, oh, I don't reflect, like I don't bother with that, I don't really have time for it, or I'm not very reflective. But then they'll talk about getting into their car and sort of thinking about what they've been up to, like in training at the end of the session, and kind of going through like what am I going to change for next time, etc. So I think quite a lot of coaches are reflective, but perhaps they don't even realize that they're doing it. So yeah, maybe that's the process of getting better reflections, perhaps just being a little bit more aware of what it is. And I think that can be quite confusing as well, because it seems quite vague, and there's lots of different ways of understanding it, lots of different definitions that come from education, business, lots of different areas. Whereas this model, I suppose, a strength of it perhaps is that it's part of learning a broader process. And it's actually that reflective conversation thing that comes from Sean, who did loads of research in the professional learning of just professionals in like building, surveying, different kind of professions. But it was quite interesting that this came from the data with coaches. So I made this model from the data and then went back to compare it to other research, and I was like, wow, it's the same process. So quite interesting.
And is there a need for, from a mentorship perspective, because again, as you say, when you're dealing with people's personal biographies that led to where they are today, let's say, is there a mentorship program that can fit into this, or is it something that maybe should come out of it, maybe? Or yeah,
good question. That's another thing that I've been thinking about a little bit in my research to follow on from this. So been quite interested to almost think like, where does the coach developer or mentor in some cases fit around that model? So like, can they sort of use bits in the model, like key points, to position themselves and help that process, along the road a little bit? Mm-hmm. So there's not any research that looks at it yet, but you've identified a great one for future work.
Yeah. Okay. I have some questions coming in. Ross Corbett is on with the question. I'm just wondering, Ross, I'm just checking here if he wants to ask this question directly, and if you do, Ross, I can have you mute yourself, and if not, no problem. I'm just trying to
You should be good to go now, Ross, if you want to ask the question.
Right.
Oh yeah, cool. Thanks, Anna. My question was just about, in terms of practically applying your research in coach education setup. So on a course, is there any kind of practical tips you have as to how you think best maximizes or gets as much stuff through the coach's filter, let's say, for want of a better term?
Yeah, Ross, are you a coach or a coach developer or something else?
Bit of both. I'm a coach, but I also do coach education as well, yeah, for
Cool.
the
Well,
coach association. So
I'll say what I think, and then I'm sure that you'll probably have your own ideas as well, because you've got those experiences to draw upon. So I think just that biography or the biographical filter bit was something that the coach developers on this program that I looked into couldn't really do much about, because it was quite short, and they had got quotes from the coach developers saying, we have no idea who these people are. So that was a bit of an issue. We had people turn up on the course that they had to assume that they were at a particular level because of their sort of prerequisites for the course, but actually, of course, those people were wildly sort of different in their experiences that they brought to that, the baggage that they bring. And that was difficult for the coach developers to negotiate, because they had no idea who these people were. So probably having some kind of pre sort of warm up type thing, even just, it's so easy to video practice now. So surely coach developers could be receiving sort of videos of practice, so at least they know where these coaches are and like who they're coaching in the run up to a course. But ideally, like, another thing that was difficult for coaches after the course was just being kind of left to get on with it. So they could quite easily just reject stuff and not bother with it. And that might be something really important for their coaching practice. So if it was a coach developer that sort of knew more about the coach before the course and was able to follow their progress through the course and then follow up and just check up and see how they're getting on and help them to make sense of stuff in practice over a longer period of time, then I imagine that would probably be pretty helpful. Maybe even just making people a little bit more aware of some of these processes that might be happening for them. So learning to learn, which would then set them up for success in future experiences too. Do you have any thoughts on that, or things that you think that have worked well in your practice?
I suppose just when I come across somebody who tends to be closed off, so like you think they're rejecting more than they're actually letting through, I just try and use peer learning as much as possible. At least that way, if you have somebody who is that bit more closed or rejecting that little bit more, at least if they're rejecting it, they have to explain their point of view to the other peers. So if they're halfway through explaining and they're there, all right, I'm not doing a good job of explaining why I'm rejecting this, maybe I should be a little bit more open. I've found that to work sometimes, but again, it's definitely a struggle of my experiences with coach education, is trying to keep people as open as possible. Yeah,
so if the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed, there was a little kind of dotted line over the individual level filter, and that said, seeing is believing. So that also came from other research by Nelson, Cushion and Potrak. They surveyed coaches to find out what they wanted from coach development opportunities. And the coaches in my research said the same, that when they could see something working in their context in particular, then they were much more likely to give that a try. So for example, like if a coach developer was to go into that coach's context and perhaps like coach their players or athletes and do something that was clearly working, they could see it working, then they might be more likely to give that thing a try. So perhaps like showing evidence that it's going to work and actually seeing that might work might be something to give a go to get past that individual level filter.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Thanks, Anna.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anna. So our next question comes in from Therese McIntyre and kind of builds off one of the examples that you provided a little bit earlier about an example you gave of a coach's practice conflicting with what happens in the club. So I'll pass you over to Therese to ask her question.
Hi, how are you, Anna? Thanks a million for that talk. Yeah, I suppose I really wonder, how do you balance how clubs might judge a coach's success versus how coaches themselves measure success? Like, say, for example, a lot of clubs, particularly the grassroots, would say unless you're bringing home titles and cups and things like that, they don't necessarily judge that as a success. Whereas I myself, if I'm retaining girls and the girls are continuing to improve their skills, that to my mind is a measure of success if they've moved on from season to season. So how do you kind of balance those two perceptions about coaching?
Yeah, that's so hard, difficult to answer. Yeah, I think that comes down to the coach's philosophy and whether they're kind of happy that that aligns with the club that they're working in or not, and whether they can influence that at the club as well. So the culture is, we're influenced by the culture that we're in, but we also influence that too. So I suppose that would be my thoughts on that. My research didn't really come up with any sort of solutions for that because it was just looking at the process of learning within that. But yeah, the context and the culture that was happening in was so important. And like my earliest paper just took two coaches on the same course, and it was like a case study of those, and they were working in different contexts, and it shows you, like, one of them was that guy that I was talking about, where he was really enthusiastic and wanted to try stuff out, and he did, but it didn't really fit in that context. And actually, he didn't make it to the end of the season at that club, so decided to leave and go somewhere else. So I think it comes down to, yeah, you as a coach, your philosophy, what you want to achieve, and whether you're comfortable in the context that you're working in. Sorry, that's not a very concrete answer, but
no, it's something to work on anyway, though. So thanks a million, Anna.
That's great. So our next question is going to come from Mark Darlington. So I've just put a request for you to unmute there, Mark. See if we can manage that. Yeah, you should be good to go.
I think that works. And thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed the presentation. Couple of things. The first one is against your model with the coffee filter. Was any work done just to try and understand from a general perspective, knowing that each of these things is individually based, as to how much is accepted, how much is rejected, and therefore how much is actually needing to have the hammer of Thor smashed into it? And leading on from that would be the vehicle by which coaches are developed and we learn. So is it that we are still fixed on a model that is very much around attending courses and getting a germ of an idea, and therefore we pick up, say, 10, 20% of what is needed in order to develop our thinking? Or do we need a different model where it's more to do with perhaps being in a field environment where a mentor comes to challenge more alongside the coach, which is perhaps a better vehicle, maybe? I don't know, just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, there's lots of different aspects to that. So no, I didn't necessarily measure the amount of stuff that was getting sort of accepted, rejected, or whatever. Obviously, it's quite difficult to measure knowledge. And so I did my best with looking at knowledge concepts, so these kind of ideas, and basically did it by looking at the knowledge concepts that the coaches talked about using in their practice before a course and again afterwards, and sort of compared. Whereas I suppose to do that research-wise, you'd have to work out what knowledge concepts were involved in the course itself and like count them all up and then see if you could trace them again at the other end, which, I mean, could be quite a fun activity, but sounds like a PhD study in itself. So I suspect, though, like when you were speaking, the second part of your question, I suspect that perhaps there might be more room for those knowledge concepts to get through someone that's quite new to coaching or doesn't hold too many sort of existing beliefs and practices too close to their heart, if that makes sense. So that's, I mean, the personal openness thing was something that was important. So like a more experienced coach could be sort sort of very tied to particular practices and knowledge, but equally they could be quite open-minded, but I guess they'll have more experiences to draw upon. So I would imagine or suggest that if someone's quite novice, and there's a lot more room for them to sort of pick up different knowledge concepts, perhaps. And then the last bit was about practicing in context. And I don't know about yourself, like over the summer, there's been loads of sort of online kind of webinars and professional development opportunities, but I've hardly coached because I haven't been allowed to. I coach rugby, and it's not exactly the most COVID-friendly sport. So I was kind of thinking to myself, like, what things have I learned that I've actually put into practice? And not very much is probably the answer to that. And in my model, it kind of explains that, like, the coaches actually, they did increase their knowledge, or they did change their knowledge on certain things that the course was trying to get across, but they didn't actually change what they did very much at all. So that change in behavior was something that was really hard to achieve for the coach developers. And the course was quite decontextualized. So I do think that basing it around practice and it being in situ, as you kind of mentioned, being where the coach is actually doing their thing, then that's quite important, because that's an important part of the learning process, where the coach is making sense of it for their own practical relevance. So once you understand how that fits into your practice, you would recognize that idea again in similar situations. You'd be able to perhaps then adapt it for different situations. But that practical element's pretty important, because also, if you, as a coach, like, if you can know as much as you want, but if you can't get it across, then what's the point in knowing it? So yeah, and the research did show that as well. So their behavior, they tended to stick to quite robust behavioral signatures, each of the coaches that I looked into. Then there was only 5 where I looked really in depth at their behaviors and their knowledge. But yeah, they did change their knowledge, but their behavior stayed pretty constant, actually.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Mark, for the great question as well. So our next question comes from Adrian. I just asked Adrian to unmute there, so you should be ready to go.
Cool. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, I guess, Anna. Just in listening, and I suppose with reference to the way the biographies play such an important part about what a coach picks up in session, is there a case to be made for breaking that, as in take the coach out of that comfort zone and put them into a different space completely? And so, you know, the example you used was soccer. Trace mentioned GA, doesn't matter. Move from that into maybe racket sport or a different field sport completely, and just break the association with skills, because the focus often is about how you're coaching a skill, and turn the emphasis, take the skill away, and you're left with the coaching. That kind of a sort of addition by subtraction kind of thing.
Yeah, so that disjuncture thing where your biography is really challenged, it's kind of similar to that idea of being taken out of your comfort zone. And so that was, it is a moment of potential for learning, because your biography has to change to make you feel comfortable again. So, I mean, you could just reject it and not sort of engage with it at all. But in order to actually sort of establish sort of harmony, this is stuff from Peter Jarvis, his sort of theories, then you have to change your biography. You have to go through sort of meaningful reflection. So that reflective process allows you to change your biography. So that reflective conversation is how it happens. So yeah, I can see value in sort of pushing coaches out of their comfort zone for that. So if that's the hammer, like, someone needs to be there to make sense of it, or to pick up the pieces a little bit and reconstruct that biography. So yeah, it might be a mentor or a coach developer, but the coach also needs to be able to put that into practice for themselves. So there's lots of arguments about transfer of skills. I'm sure as skill acquisition Ireland, you're probably well used to having those discussions. It's not my area of expertise at all, but yeah, the coach would still have to be able to pick out concepts from that new context that they're in and apply it to their own context, so they've got their own individual understanding of how it would work in their own practice too. But I have worked on an evaluation program for UK sport, where we evaluated like a high level coach education program where they brought coaches from different sports together. And that seemed to be really powerful. The coaches got a lot from being part of that community and learning from different sports.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Adrian. Your question puts me in mind of some teaching that Paul Robinson set up in Chichester and the coaching program there, where he would have coaches in their first coaching practice. They'd have to deliver on a sport that was unfamiliar to them. So deliberately, rugby player came in, he'd say, great, you're going to coach trampolining. And it was exactly for that reason, subtraction reason you outlined, spot on. And that served them to then give them a lens to look at their own coaching later. And they learned an awful lot from the exercise. So I think absolutely, if it's got the right structure to it, you can get some great learning out of that. Our next question comes from Seamus Flynn. Seamus, I've just unmuted you there, so you should be good to go.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, Anna. It's kind of related to what Phil was just saying and what Adrian, the question Adrian, or the way you answered Adrian's question. Is there a case to be made for communities of practice in relation to coach education? I'm thinking particularly in relation to official education, rather than everybody going to course. And I was just thinking, listening to Phil there, is there a case to be made for community practice where coaches from different sports are brought together to learn from each other?
Yeah, definitely. So I was actually at a webinar with Bev and Etienne Wenger Trainer in the week, and they're the people that sort of applied this sort of communities of practice kind of thing to sports coaching for, and that was quite interesting because it was all very much about learning through practice, and that communities of practice, the practice bit being really important. And yeah, I think so. I've just designed a little coach development program for women coaches in my local area, and I have kind of structured it around this model, but it's basically like making a community of practice with this model as a structure. So to start with, it's about meeting as a group to sort of explore our biographies or just kind of acknowledge the learning process a little bit, learn a bit more about that. Then the next bit's about looking at the context that we work in and just sort of kind of how can we shape that. And then it's a series of reflective conversations where the content for that might come from something like a formal coach education course. So they can go and choose what CPD or whatever that they want to engage with. But the learning comes from applying that in practice and using the group to sort of reflect and go through that reflective conversation and just kind of go through that cycle over and over again. So I don't have any evidence that that actually is going to work because I'm just doing it now, but that's a suggestion for me that I think could work. So yeah, I think there is a case to be made for communities of practice. I suppose the research in communities of practice from back in like the early 2000s, where they tried to set them up a bit, they found that the facilitator of that is so important. So it's more than just a group of people that are just there together. They have to have like a sort of learning kind of objective, something they're actually working towards, like a shared kind of, a shared objective and a shared kind of problem of practice that they're kind of exploring together. So where they tried to set them up in sort of the mid to early 2000s, they didn't have a lot of success when the facilitator wasn't there helping that much, or it basically was underpinned by whoever was leading that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to say, in terms of the community of practice research, really looking forward to some research that Will Harmon, involved with the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, is engaging in on community of practice. It's early days yet, but I think really excited about where that research is going to go. Our next question comes from Margaret Farrelly. So Margaret, I've just unmuted you there. You should be good to go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Anna, for your presentation so far. I suppose the question I have is, can previous experiences as a player or coach influence uptake during coach education workshops? So like a predetermined learning or behavioural change, or does it happen or does it not happen?
Yeah, so do you mean like how do previous experiences as a player or a coach impact on sort of learning?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, as I noticed that someone in the earlier bit in the chat, oh, it was you. There we go. Influence / impact of former coaches at underage level. Yeah. So I did notice that earlier on when I was asking about biography. And I think that those are just, yeah, key experiences that shape who you are and shape your biography. So that is going to influence what you think about new stuff that you encounter. So for example, so are you a coach?
Yes, I'm a coach, yeah.
And so did you partake in the sport? Were you a participant in the sport before you were a coach?
Yes, I did, yeah. So I was a player as well as a coach. So I suppose, yeah, so I've adopted my coaching style, maybe taken the positives and probably just been in the negative impacts of coaching that I had maybe as a player. So it's maybe not been in, but maybe adapting to different approaches maybe to coaching and trying to influence players maybe differently.
Yeah, so, and quite often people will just start out coaching the way that they were coached because they don't really know any different. And so I think from what you were saying, it sounds similar to some of my experiences where someone recently asked me, oh, you've been had lots of success in sports, so you must have had really good coaches when you were younger. And I was like, well, not really. I can't really think of any good coaches from when I was growing up. I came to rugby quite late, so that's not a slight against my rugby coaches. But yeah, so I suppose I've picked up on the things that I don't want to do as a coach as well.
And did your study reflect that as well, like, you know, in terms of predetermined, you know, where a coach or a player had coming into a coach education workshop has sort of predetermined notions or ideas?
Yeah, so there was one example of like one of the coaches was talking about his kind of approach to defense and how like he'd grown up playing soccer as a defender and enjoying when like the parents and stuff came to watch, and you just put in a great slide tackle like down the wing, like top speed, absolutely take someone out and the ball with them, and getting all that praise from the supporters, etc. And then kind of struggling with adapting their coaching to kind of reward a slightly more subtle approach rather than just sort of encouraging people to take out everyone near them. So yeah, I suppose just it's more just the making people sort of aware that these things are happening rather than, yeah, so just making people, some people are just not aware of how their previous experiences might be shaping their kind of future learning. And it's just to stop people potentially just rejecting something that could be the most important thing for their coaching.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Margaret, as well. So our next question comes from David Abbott. So David, I've just unmuted you there. You should be good to go.
Hello. So I know that you guys are probably wrapping up a little bit, so I'll try not to make it too long, but basically I just want to know more or less, have you found any strong correlations in the biography of coaches that makes them more accepting or kind of more rejecting in terms of how they implement new ideas?
Okay, so correlations around research, it's got lots of research connotations. So no, I didn't find any correlations because I wasn't looking at sort of numerical quantitative data, but in terms of things that influenced openness to new things and implementing new things, yeah, there was like a personal openness. So lots of research in the past with expert coaches, if you can, if that such a thing exists, they talk about expert coaches quite often talk about always learning, so always being thirsty for new knowledge and new ideas. And I think the coaches in this research were the same, in that the ones that seemed most open were sort of very motivated and keen to learn. And that's something I don't actually have loads of in-depth data on, and it's something I'm very interested in. So like the more open you are, the more you might approach different learning situations as well. So as well as filtering out stuff, it's kind of before that, that's influencing what you choose to take notice of and the things that you choose to engage with. But then there was also like broader things in the context. So some coaches were working in a professional academy, so an English Premier League academy, which you might think that might be a bit more traditional. They might have more kind of set ways or views on success and allowing coaches to experiment, they might not want that because they're looking for success. But actually, that was probably the most open environment that I saw, because the coaches were routinely sort of catching up with each other at the end of practice and just sort of saying, oh, I tried this, like, what did you think? And this happened and that happened, and I might try this next time. And so that was kind of set up as something that they would debrief together and just discuss what they were up to in their coaching. And so that really helped them to be a bit more innovative and try different ideas out. So yeah, there is like a personal, like an individual thing, but I guess it's like the whole model as well. There was something in the context as well. So if you're all coaches, you probably are well aware of creating a context for your players to learn, but what about context for your own learning as well as a coach?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're last couple of questions. So just one from me, Anna. So I'm going to put you on the spot here a little. So you mentioned it earlier, but if you were to be able to design a coach education course or program, what would be maybe the top 1 or 2 priorities that you would focus on it? And then how would you define success from that program? Would it be learning? Would it be longer term behavior change? Or would it even be something like retainment of those coaches in the sport for a number of years?
Good question. They asked me that in my PhD Viva. So there we go. Better warm up for this one. Good thing I've had quite a lot of questions to warm up for it. So the key things would be to have some kind of longitudinal, like a longer term, like I guess relationship with whoever is developing them and the coaches themselves, so that they know who they are, they have some sense of their biography beforehand, and can support them afterwards as well in their context. So yeah, the knowledge of who the coach is and what they bring from the start, but also a follow-up in situ. So it's got some stuff like taking place in the context that the coach is working in. And probably that like going through cycles of reflective conversations, so the opportunity to try stuff out, adapt it, and a coach developer would probably structure that and use sort of questionings to facilitate that reflective conversation. How would I define success? That's a big question. It sort of depends. Yeah, it would depend on the context, wouldn't it really? But for me, maybe just coaches that are a bit more like self-aware, like aware of how they learn, to help them be able to do that in all the different learning situations that they encounter, and like have a motivation or a thirst for further learning, like a curiosity. And so, as I said, that aspect's quite interesting to me. I don't really know of much, well, I don't really have lots of data on that bit of it, but I think that's quite interesting. And also like how coaches judge the quality of information that they come across as well. So like maybe it's quite grand, but like success for me potentially would be the ability to develop coaches that are sort of curious, they understand a bit about themselves and how they learn, and they have the ability to keep learning in the future.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, actually. So I'll hand over to Ed now. Last question before we wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Ali. And I love the questions that have been coming in, because I think a lot of them are reading my mind. There's a lot of questions that I had myself that have already been asked, but one that keeps jumping out is this question around the community of practice. And there's just a couple of things on that. Number one, I suppose from a community of practice, there's what are the routes to it? And probably Phil wouldn't mention this himself, but I think it's important that I do. Phil is the course director of an MSc in applied sports coaching in UL, and I know what they do in this, and it is very much built around a community practice in a somewhat of a formal setting, but also in a space of, and I suppose I'm speaking here to maybe some of the people on here who are from Ireland and who maybe are looking to how do I expand my thinking on this type of way of an approach to coach education. And I think it's worthy for people. I think it's worthwhile for people maybe to check out the UL website for that, because my understanding of what Phil has told me and us about that course is very much about that community of practice. and very much about learning from each other's experiences and learning from, you know, how to avoid your own biases in coaching and how to open up your mind to different ways of coaching. So, but on that point, around one of the points I think that Seamus Flynn spoke about, the idea of taking coaches out of their comfort zone. Is that something that in coach education, and maybe coach education needs to be massively restructured anyway for how we currently measure it, but is that something we can do in coach education while also ensuring that people do engage in it? Because sometimes I think when people hear, oh my God, that I have to go to do my foundation level, and they take you out of your comfort zone even at foundation level, would that spook people? But if the other side of it is, if we start doing it early in the coach education process, maybe they won't get so spooked when people start asking to maybe expand their way of doing things. Is there a question in there?
Yeah, it's similar to what we were saying before about the support around that. Obviously, and it would depend at the level of the coach as well. Like if they have no idea what they're doing because they've never done it before, then they're already out of their comfort zone. So you probably don't need to add to that. But equally, like I've reflected on that in my own coaching, like I'm quite keen to sort of plan ahead and make sure that everything's, you know, I know that it's going to work or whatever, and you don't like it when you're sort of made to be uncomfortable. But actually, when you look back on the things that have influenced you and you've learned most from as a coach, they're probably the most uncomfortable things that you've come across. Like I did my rugby coaching level 3, finished it last year, and on that course, I just like had an absolute brain meltdown because I was trying to implement too much new stuff, and like all the layers of like what is going on in the situation. The coach developer came across to me and said, what are you trying to, what's the aim for the players? And I was like, I don't know, that I should know what that is, but I can't even so but then that was quite a useful learning kind of situation, and the lesson for me was not to try and change too much in one go. So I suppose the moving the coach out of their comfort zone, it might depend on their biography. So how much can you push them at that particular time, and the support of the coach developer to rebuild biography.
Which kind of speaks to one of your early points, which might be a nice way to bring it back to the beginning, is similar learning situations can lead to uneven learning, that even at a foundation level, because a lot of our sports in Ireland, we're very strong at getting coaches going through early, the early stages of coaching. But even at that, as you said, there's some people, it's like a fish out of water, even for them there. And is there a way that as coach developers and coach educators, we can make it a little less, anxious or a little less overwhelming, even for the people who are already out of their comfort zone at a foundation level?
Yeah, coaching is bloody hard, isn't it? I remember when I started out and it was, awful. So, you want people to obviously still keep coming back, and actually, if it's, especially at the youth level, you need people to be doing that job. So as long as they can be able to do that safely and effectively enough, then that's fine too. And John Lyle writes about this a little bit sometimes, like just adjusting our expectations of what we should be requiring at different sort of stages or levels, or adjusting our expectations of what can be achieved from coach education, for example.
Yeah, fair point. Well, listen, I know we could go on, but we probably will when we wrap this up. But we have to be conscious of people's commitment to us and our time. Thank you so much, Anna, and I really appreciate your time today. But also the insights have been absolutely fantastic. And so, on behalf of all of us, really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you again on MSAI.
Thanks for having me. Great questions, everyone. It's quite intense. I've had to think a lot.
Great. Echo Ed's thoughts there on behalf of MSAI. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your wonderful work. So that's it for episode 6. Quickly coming around the corner, we've got episode 7. That's going to be on this coming Tuesday at 6 o'clock. And we've got someone who I work quite closely with, Mel Marshall, is coming on to do a Q&A session. So Mel Marshall is a swimming coach, works for British Swimming, and is coach to arguably one of the best swimmers in the world right now, Adam Peaty. So keep an eye on our Twitter feed for more details about how to register and check in that. So thanks for joining in. I hope everybody has a great weekend and see you all soon. Bye. Okay, stop recording.